Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? Welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. In this episode, Cameron has brought us a guest. Please, Cameron, tell us who you brought.
Yes, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Varqa Abyaneh, who has an interesting sort of multi-background, if I can say so, starting with a PhD in physics, but then also having worked extensively in the banking world, which I guess is not so much physics as it is the kind of mathematics, right, and modeling that you learn in connection with physics. And now, most recently, Varqa, like many others, has been engaged in looking into the possibilities of artificial intelligence. But what he brings to this, aside from his scientific background, is the deep philosophical thoughts and insights that he has, because just like the rest of us in this podcast, he's also a philosopher of if not by profession, but we have said that we are amateur philosophers, in the sense that amateur originally meant someone who loves something and does it for the love of the matter rather than in order to earn money through it. So we have here a gentleman who brings a sort of a combination, a multitude of perspectives combined, and so we're looking very much forward to having a discussion with him about this very topical issue of AI and ethics and what's going to happen to us and our humanity as AI develops. Something along those lines, right?
Well, you're given a very, very blank slate here, so
yes, exactly.
I guess, yeah, sometimes it's good to have a little bit of an idea of where to start. But this is interesting, and as you said, I do get interested in the philosophical aspects as well as the technical aspects of AI. So, look, where should we start? I think with most things, it's good to start by defining what do we mean by ethics and morality, and what do we mean by and what do we even mean by AI, right? As in, there's lots of different branches of AI. There's machine learning, there's generative AI. More recently, generative AI has been important. But I think starting at what do we mean by ethics would be interesting. I think if we go down that route, we might end yeah, we may end up in a more structured place. However, I must say that if we start by asking that question, we might never get to the topic of AI as well, right? So,
True.
the reason in me saying that was to pass the baton to someone else there and say, oh, look, I can start talking about the AI, but the ethics is going to be hard and you guys are going to be the expert on that. I'm going to take like you, Stephen. We've got a physics background, right? So I guess I'd take a slightly more experimental view and say, okay, let's not define an abstract definition of ethics or morality, and let's just define the outcomes of experiments. So if we just say humans want to interact or act in a certain way, there's a question of, is acting in a certain way objectively ethical or subjectively ethical? That would be my first question. Is there an objective definition of it? I have a kind of inclination to a certain view here, but maybe I'll ask that to you.
Maybe, well, let me actually go back a half a step before that. Right. It might help, I don't know, frame the question. Thinking of the universe as a physical system comprised of lots of particles, waves, obeying certain laws. It's a lot of things that are described as things that are, whereas ethics describes what we ought to do. So when we think of the world through the lens of physics, it's the world of is, and when we look at the world through the lens of ethics, it's the realm of ought. And like in classical philosophy, I think Hume was the one who talks about this with great clarity, that there is almost an unbridgeable gap between what is and what ought. And we can't really get from a simple description, physical description of the world to a description of what we ought to do without introducing certain assumptions, which we would like to make those explicit. Usually they're implicit, but if we can make those assumptions explicit, then it really adds to the clarity of our thinking about what we're talking about. So what would be the assumptions you have to add to a system that is very well physically described as something that is, to something that ought? And just to take an initial stab, and maybe you have another idea about how to do it, but also, starting from this very physical perspective, one way of talking about ought would be to say that that there's a symmetry breaking going on. There is a sense in which everything is equally described. Everything is the same in all directions, and unless there is some field applied that gives a certain direction, a preferred direction. So say a magnetic field, in the absence of a magnet, you have iron filings in random orientations, but in the presence of a magnetic field, those iron filings align in one particular direction. Can we think about the ought in the moral sense as a kind of preferred direction of action, of physical action in the universe? And since we're talking about us, we're talking about human action in the universe. So in the absence of ought, in the absence of ethics and morality, one could choose any action and it would be equally fine from a fundamental perspective. But if you add this alignment of things, then certain actions become preferable. And those actions that are aligned with that magnetic field would be actions that we define as moral or ethical, and those which are orthogonal to that field, we would define as either amoral, or those are opposite to the field, we would define as immoral. Would that be a potentially useful starting point to talk about ethics, or is there another way to go?
Could I just also comment on that one before? Yeah, because you could turn this idea on the head, saying that what is actually existing is the ethical part of our reality, and the physical part is just something we are adding. And that seems a little bit strange to us, because we are always using the eyes and the empirical existence so deeply. So it's very difficult for us to believe this. But even in the physical world, I would say there are always this kind of ought to do, which means that there are always this part, the ethical part of existence is always in us, and not only in the human existence, but in reality. So I think to me, it's like, yeah, and of course, especially in the human choices we do, well, whatever we choose to do, there is always a ought. Even though we will say that we are doing something just purely descriptive, or we are doing science, or whatever we do, then even the words we are using have this kind of normativity in them. So I think it's for me, it's important to try to understand that the ought question, okay, it might be something totally opposite of the is question, but it's still always with us in reality.
Yeah. So yeah, that is very interesting. Both of what you said, and look, and it was kind of along the lines of what I was thinking in terms of, yeah, you've got the is and then you've got the ought. So my original question of like, what is ethics, was to basically say, is there an objective definition of ought, or is it that we all sit there and go, I ought to think, I think it ought to be like this, and therefore say, and that's objective ethics. Actually, it's just what I think it ought to be. So, so let's avoid the harder question for the time being, maybe, of whether there's a unique definition of ought. And let's assume, for the time being, maybe, that we all have a definition of ought, and it's up to us to argue what that correct ought is, or come to an agreement of what that ought is, right? So if we do that, and the reason why I say to do that is not because I don't think the question of whether there's a unique ought or a unique definition of ethics is important. It's just because then we can maybe go on to the AI piece of it. Because once you get into and you say, okay, this is what things ought to be, and I say, okay, this is what it ought to be. So let's make a real tangible example. This is not my view, just to be clear, but let's just imagine I say, I think all people ought to have equal living standards, right? And I said, because that's ethical. Then there's a question of how do we achieve that, right? And the way that could be achieved is in multiple different ways. So if this was a classical optimization problem, you'd have the objective function to be the ought state, our current state, and then what's the optimal way to get to the ought state, to which there'd be many routes. Now, sometimes you might have politicians who sit around and they agree on the ought state, and then they argue on the way to get there. So one says, I think taxes should be 40%. The other one says, no, I think we should be printing more money. The other one says, I think we should be closing our borders. Whatever it is the way to achieve that ought state. So there's two things. Three things. Is there a unique ought? Okay, let's assume we put that to one side. The next question is, how do we achieve a particular ought state? Now, just to jump into AI, what I think AI might be very good at is the latter part of that, is once you've defined the ought state, to be able to figure out how to get from our current state to the ought state, because that is ultimately an optimization problem, and you're starting to deal with real variables. Once you pull a tangible physical end state for the ought state, then there's potentially an optimal way of achieving that, and humans might not be as good as AI at figuring that out. And by the way, in the same way, let's put an analogy to this. Satellite navigation system. The satellite navigation system doesn't decide where we want to go. It doesn't decide where we ought to be. But once we define where we ought to be, it is far better and quicker than a human with a map that quickly drawing out the optimal route to get there.
So under that definition, AI is a powerful tool to accomplish human ends.
Yeah.
But if I put my perspective in, then if it's correct that, as I say, that we always have the ought with us, even when we are presenting means to some goals. Then we will still have like a possibility here to use ethical wrong means to get those oughts or these goals that we are supposed or we think should be part of our society. Do you follow me? That the AI answers might also have ethical standards.
Okay, so would you say that the AI is promoting ethical standards there, or would you say that's a constraint on the system? So let's imagine using the satellite navigation system route, where you say, find the optimal route to get to our ought state, to get to Manchester. And let's imagine that we're all living in England and we're going from London to Manchester. Find the optimal route to get there. However, I'm going to put a constraint, and it's an inverted commas ethical constraint, and it is you can't go through points where there's lots of traffic or where there's recently been a crash. Is that what you're saying? Are you saying put a constraint on your optimization, or are you actually saying introducing a new end state?
No, it was about the means.
The means, yeah.
Yeah. So I think you understood me correctly, yes.
Yeah.
But of course, maybe it's easier when the goal is to get from one place to another than having like this example of equal living standard. Because then to create the equal living standard, then you could even have even worse means.
Yes, agreed. So let's imagine using the equal living standards. Potentially a constraint would be, please do not give me a solution where every single person is killed and there's only one person left and therefore everything is equal, right? That would potentially be...
I was just going to propose that would be a great...
You're going to do it? It'd be like Ultron from Avengers, yeah.
Yeah. Just go and make paper clips, fill the world
exactly,
and then 0 equals 0 equals 0 7 billion times.
I wonder whether we could sort of turn this around also, and because now we've been talking about like what is our conception of ethics and how does AI enter it, but could we use the way that AI functions or can function as a way to understand our own conceptualization of ethics and what the role of ethics is? So sort of reverse that kind of perspective, and by that virtue, for instance, would AI be able to help us to find where we should be going, either by saying that we want to go somewhere, I don't know, where there's untouched nature, or by giving some sort of ethical premises, or could it even help us think of what kind of ethical premises we ought to have?
So I don't have an answer to that, and I was deliberate in saying I think AI can help us get there with the means, because then I'd kind of be at least committing to a stance and that like I'm engaging in topics. The harder question is, yes, can it actually define it, and can it itself be ethical? So if we were to say, I think we, so let's use the all people being equal situation. There's a question of saying, okay, well, should you optimize and make wealth? I'm creating a very simplified system over here of a bunch of humans, and there's wealth, and subject to the other constraint, we're not allowed to kill anyone in order to get equality. So one person says everyone should be equal, and then another person says, no, what we should be doing is not trying to get everyone equal. Someone says we should be trying to get everyone equal and maximizing everyone. Fair enough. But someone might just say we should just maximize the sum total of everyone, even if there's disparity, right? And that's a classic left and right wing argument at the moment, right? That's that's basically all of politics potentially in a nutshell is, or at least what people debate over. So then the question is could AI actually tell us the right balance? As in, we should be optimizing to make total wealth higher, regardless of whether there's inequalities, or whether we should be optimizing wealth so that everyone is equal, or whether we should be optimizing wealth so the total is higher, but subject to the standard deviation between the 99th richest percentile richest and the 99th percent poorest not being greater than X. I don't know.
Of course, it's difficult, especially, I don't know if you use political standards as the ethical standards, but if you use consequence ethics, they would say that what should be like the highest goal for humanity is to have give as many people as possible happiness.
And that, I think, raises to me a question, if I could, I mean, if this slightly pushes back on your proposal, because your proposal implies that it's possible to, computationally define morality in a sense, that you can build an ethical system and formalize it as an algorithm. And the algorithm we've just been discussing would be one that says, for example, equalize wealth versus maximize wealth. And is that an ethical system? I mean, or does ethics include something non-computational? Are we missing something if we just think that we can reduce an ethical goal, performed by an AI, to something which ultimately can be quantified as, wealth generation versus wealth equalization?
So yeah, makes sense. So I guess that there is a question of, is there any physical action or physical end state in the universe that we can apply the label ethics to it, right? There's another viewpoint, which is there's a whole bunch of actions people can do, and we label them as being, some of them we say are ethical. So if we go back to the earlier definition where we said there might be many definitions of ethics, and it's just basically us arguing for what the end state is. So within that framework, I think potentially it's okay, because we effectively axiomatically said it's okay, and we said it's okay. But yeah, I mean, maybe an example, if I've understood you correctly, is two people could argue for the same end state, but for different, and one might be ethical and one might not be ethical, right? There might be something to do with the intrinsic motivation of someone, of behind even doing an action, and therefore the action itself is not the definition. Ethics cannot be defined experimentally by the action. Like an example of that would be if someone wants to go and say, listen, I think there should be world peace. And I'm not naming any world leaders at the moment, but there might be, some world leaders who say, I really want world peace, and they want world peace for the recognition of being the person who got world peace. Whereas there might be someone else saying, I really want world peace because they genuinely feel that they want to reduce, the suffering of people. Both of them want the same end state. So in a model that we've been discussing to now, you'd have to say they're both ethical. However, Stephen, I'm correct that you're saying, well, potentially not really, right?
Potentially not really, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, fair enough. I agree. Okay, I can see that.
I think when it comes to thinking that AI should be able to bring the correct means to a goal, for me this sounds like consequence ethics. It's not like virtue ethics or the Kantian kind of ethics, but deontological ethics. But it sounds very consequence ethics. That's why I think happiness, because this has really been discussed in like 300 years or more or less. It has been discussed, and what they are always like assuming, what they are ending up in, is this question of happiness. So for me, it would be very interesting trying to understand, could AI help humanity becoming more happy?
Yeah, maximize happiness. But then that gets to my question: is that a computational problem? I could easily see if one could reduce ethics to maximizing some sort of materially measurable thing, like various material wealth in its various manifestations that can be measurable, then we can see AI as like the greatest thing that ever happened to humanity, because now we turn the thing on, and suddenly we're like headed in the direction of a more ethical world. But if ethics is maximizing human happiness, then even if everyone now has equal standard of living, is that going to maximize happiness or not? If now we have the sum total of wealth on the planet has now 10x'd, over the next 10 years because AI has been so efficient in getting things done. Are we happier or not? And well, but is it the job of an AI? This is kind of a separate question. Is it the job of AI to operate in the moral domain in that sense? I mean, we're making the assumption that we can think of AI as this powerful tool that we can turn the dial one way or another and assist us in leading us into a more ethical world. Whereas it seems to me that it's built more it's built more to maximize things that can be physically measured.
But maybe we could turn it upside down, because there's some of the consequence ethics theorists have said that we should, instead of, I think actually it's Karl Popper says that we shouldn't focus too much on happiness, but what makes human unhappy. And if we are trying to remove whatever makes us unhappy, then it's the possibility of happiness is larger.
But I think, I mean, I think happiness is a very good example, because I think that although it may sound very simple and obvious, I think this is exactly where the complication exists, because happiness means very different things to different people. And the question, I think this is where I would like to see how AI can help us better understand the very nature of ethics. Is that, and as Stephen has been referring to this, I mean, is ethics in the end something that can be reduced to some sort of computational logic, or is there some element to ethics that is beyond that? And if it is something beyond that, is it just like Varqa was saying, that okay, we have like personal ethics and personal oughts, and is it just like everybody responding to their sort of selfish needs or something like that, that is the basis of our ethics? Or how can we find some sort of a somehow waterproof definition for what ethics should be based on? And perhaps if we can agree on something like that, I think our chances of being able to somehow unite around some ethical principles would be much greater.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are going straight into the really hard questions. We don't even need to talk about AI to talk. Can humans get to figure it out? Yeah, so I think the issue is as soon as you say that fundamental ethics is effectively not reducible to, it cannot be reduced into or explained by the physical universe. As soon as you say that, then it becomes very hard for humans to even know if each other are being ethical, right? So experimentally, we're each going to propose our own end states, right? And if we're saying that your ethics or something like that, is not reducible to something, is not reducible or something that's measurable, that can be objectively observed by measuring the universe in some way, then you end up in a hard situation, because I can never even judge whether you're being objective, because all I can really do, in my interactions with you, whilst I think you're a very ethical person, I can only do measurements on words that you say and actions that you do, etc. So I think once we postulate that ethics is not reducible, then I think it becomes hard for any other human to even, for humans to even judge each other. And by the way, if, not to go religious or something like that, but there's a lot of religious scriptures which seem to indicate that humans should never judge each other, because they can never really know what the motivation is or what their underlying intention is. So maybe if we go down that route, yes, there is some objective definition, and maybe let's not use the word ethics, let's use the word good, like a good action or a good motivation. But if we say that is not at all measurable, then by looking at the universe, then I think any other human or AI cracking it, we might have just ruled it out by definition, if that makes sense.
Maybe we can agree that even if ethics is non-computational, that we can nevertheless find computational goals that are directionally aligned enough that it's useful to move forward, on that basis. And if we can agree that, because then it gets us more into the realm of AI and away from the realm of how do we define ethics, then we're left with this very complicated problem that we're not talking about humanity collectively deciding to place itself under the guidance of a single AI system. At least at the moment, we have competing AI systems with arguably competing, let's say, ethical type rules baked into them. We have our Claudes and our open AIs, we have our Groks and our llamas, and we have DeepSeek, and all of these at the moment, we have a sort of a competitive field of different AI algorithms. We don't know which is going to win the day, but we can imagine, one AI algorithm that ultimately is aligned with a kind of ethic of equalization, and a separate AI algorithm aligned with the ethic of maximizing material prosperity. And which of these is going to win? And how do we, how do we think about that problem?
So would you say that is the kind of what you're asking there is kind of the equivalation is, if we go back to our destination, is figuring out what's the right destination to go to, acknowledging that whilst we don't even know if we can say a destination is ethical, we kind of have to buy into the fact that at least there is some sort of correlation, or we can somehow project ethics into some sphere, for example, we know that the solution of killing everyone is, we'd say that's not ethical, right? So we'd say that's not acceptable. But yeah, then there's a sphere where things are, where people, and this is, I guess, where the debate seems to happen, right? And it's a debate in politics that seems to happen all the time, right? Which is,
yeah, well, I mean, equalization versus maximization maybe is the pithiest way of summarizing it. And those
exactly.
are two different ways of an AI trying to hit a goal. And they're very different. And maybe in some cases they're perfectly aligned, and maybe in some cases they're anti-aligned.
Yeah,
makes sense. Definitely.
So I mean, I'm trying to remember the name of this New York-based philosopher who says that, and I think that makes good sense. That as Knut Ove said, I mean, we often think that yes, all rational decisions have some sort of an ethical aspect to them, but this person, he is of the opinion that it also works vice versa. I mean, not that we can sort of use rational arguments or rational basis in order to create a moral value sort of out of nothing. But once we are presented a candidate, so to say, to a moral value, we can then judge it by rational tests to see whether this is something that could be accepted as a moral value or not. What is your thought about that? So there, maybe AI could help us to put a suggested ethical principle through multiple rational tests, so to say, to see whether it's something that. So for instance, to say we should beat children, or we should, I don't know, keep women out of society, social influence or whatever. We should allow everyone to do whatever they want. So any argument like that or any proposal to an ethical principle like that can be put to the test of rational consequences or rational implications, and to see whether this could be, in that sense, a good candidate for an ethical principle. And then, of course, the issue raised that, like, are we to accept something that is irrational as a moral standard?
I'm assuming when you say the ethical principle, what you mean, and I'm just using the same terminology, which probably is now haunted us because it started, a proposed end state. So if you're saying that that's then the AI can look at that and start to say, does that standpoint, is that in line with our other principles? I think yes. If that's what you're saying, then I think it can. I think AI has got very powerful reasoning. Admittedly and arguably embarrassingly, I actually used it for that exactly. So I've had a debate with myself for a long time of whether I should be vegetarian or not, and I don't really know the answer. And I did sit there, I did pass it through the strongest reasoning models, and I said, look, firstly, you figure out what the solution should be on your own. Secondly, I want to minimize harm to all sentient beings. Thirdly, I want to minimize the harm to all sentient beings ranked by intelligence. What's the optimal thing? Is it to eat all meat? Is it to eat free range meat? And I think on those types of things, AI can give it's good at reasoning, right? Because it can read mass amounts of data. So it can hold more data than a human can. I think it can hold longer chain of thoughts than most humans. And I believe even if it can't, it will be able to in the future. And that what I mean by that is, you, as Kamal was saying, you say here's an end state, and you've given all of your other ideas or constraints, and you just see whether this is in contradiction with any of them, right? And I think it should be able to figure that out soon. So I think yes, in those regards, it can help humanity. Also, one thing which we haven't touched upon yet is, sure, AI can get biased with biased training data, etc. But compared to some humans, it's far less biased. So in terms of the risks that you'd have if you tried to put a policy forward to the government, is the individual person, regardless of whether or not regardless of whether or not they've got the cognitive capability to reason, they might just not be incentivized to reason in a way that aligns with the principles that they're spouting to pretend to be aligning to. So I think there it can be useful, right? So let's give one example of this. If we said taxation, once you say, I think that the wealth should be distributed like this, then I think AI can give a taxation number and give a better argument and rationality potentially for what that number should be to achieve that state. Well, certainly than potentially some politicians might do, which they say, well, it should be this number because the other guy's a really bad person, and let me talk about how bad person the other person is. My number, therefore, is proposed number is right. And just one more thing, I know I'm talking here a lot. The concept of whether that end state is itself, there's a one-to-one mapping between absolute AI, which might live outside, absolute ethics, which might not even be explainable in terms of anything in this universe, and our projection of it into what we want to achieve and where we want to get to. That itself might be time dependent. So in the equality versus saving everyone's, the equality versus maximizing the total, I can think of a system straight away where, I might say that if there's a system where there's 2 million people on Earth, I would favor a bit more equality. But if there's, me and 2 other people, and and then some super person like Einstein, and the way the problem humanity faces at the moment is scientific, I'd be like, you know what, give all the resources to Einstein because that's our best hope of survival. So it might be time dependent as well.
I find your example of vegetarian very interesting, because it makes AI, not a question about politics or about what is coming good for everyone, but what is good for you. And even though I believe that what is happiness for one person is more or less the same as everybody else, but sometimes we don't even know what is best for ourselves, and we're doing all kind of strange things. But anyway, what I find interesting is that in a deontological perspective in ethics, we will say that the ethical part of human is to make their own choices. But now you are like saying that maybe we should bring AI in and not only, being responsible for our own choices, but even using AI to make our choices more rational in the consequence thinking way. And this is of course interesting as long as we don't excuse our own choices based on what AI might give us of rationality.
Yeah, that was a very good point, because to me this then creates a sort of analogical situation. I mean, because this whole podcast is about bringing together Athens and Jerusalem, and from the Jerusalem point of view, there are these individuals who are known as being some sort of divinely inspired individuals, or divine teachers, or whatever term you want to call, and they are seen as those who have some sort of a final, supreme, and infallible idea of what is best for us. And now is the question that can AI be a counterpart of something like that, so that we can sort of delegate the choice of what should be our goal in life, or how we should behave to AI? And if so, then what's the difference between AI and, let's say, Prophet Muhammad or Jesus Christ or the Buddha or whatever? And and so how do we reconcile AI with a metaphysical perspective? Because I think fundamentally, even though, I mean, especially since the Enlightenment and very much due to the philosophizing of Immanuel Kant, I mean, the idea has been that we can have morality without a metaphysical element. But I think, anyway, initially, historically, it seems like the very concept of ethics has come from religion. So I would like to raise this question and see what you think about sort of metaphysical aspects of ethics, and how does AI possibly help us understand that?
I feel like I have to do a lot of talking here. So, is there anyone else?
I'll throw something on the table, and then if we think of the prophet as a source of morality from outside the system, from outside the space-time continuum, then it's harder for me to imagine how we would how AI would necessarily be harnessed in a way that would if not replace it, but in some way act collinearly with it. But if we think of the prophet as something unique but within the system, the fruit on the tree, we're all leaves on a tree, but there are fruits on that tree. So we have an example in the physical world of a system which is it all shares the same DNA. There's something that connects it, but they're differentiated parts, and certain parts contain capacities and potentialities that other parts don't have. If we think of these prophetic individuals throughout history as being like the fruit on the tree of humanity, then through that organic metaphor, we can think of them as kind of being like the leading edge of the evolution of human consciousness. If we think of it in those terms, then an AI system built as a kind of sum total of human wisdom over the eons could easily be very much aligned with the role that prophets have played in the past.
Mm.
But so it depends on your metaphysical stance on what's going on here in religious history, which is a huge question, and definitely beyond the topic of AI per se. But I mean, if we're going to talk about ethics at some point, I think we do have to address that question of where do ethics come from? Are they coming from outside the system or from within the system? Or is that dichotomy a false dichotomy? That's also possible. It's a third option.
I think that's as good an answer as I can put, because effectively what you're saying is, by definition, if you're saying that these previous leaders, let's say they're the founders of religions or divinely inspired individuals, let's say, if they've come from outside of the system, then by definition, AI is not going to be able to do that, unless you say that's also come from outside the system, which I don't think it was. I think it's been created by humans, and we've got scientific papers pointing to when and why it came about, and we actually have got quite a good understanding of it. But your fruits on the tree is a nice example. If it's within the system, then yes, and then of course, why not? Would AI not be able to do that? And by definition, as you said, I'm just repeating what you said just because I agree with it. By definition, it's got access to all the knowledge and all the books and everything that they've done. So it's already got all of that, plus the rest of humanity's knowledge, which might enhance the training data set or might dilute it. I don't know, but let's imagine it didn't make it worse. Then I can see. I think it is a hard question, and I think right at the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned the word. I'm just going to assume that we can't answer it, and assume that we all have to argue for what we think is ethical, the end state, because that question, I think, is one where, and I don't want to say it's hard for science to do. I think by definition it might be impossible for science to probe. If you're postulating things outside of the measurable universe, and you ask for me to prove it prove that by experiments on the measurable universe, it's going to be hard. And I know, Stephen, you've got a cosmology background, and you're going to say no, it is possible because you can show that the universe is actually curved by doing measurements on the universe. So Riemann has disproved me on that, but you know what I'm saying.
I could try to say that also in my understanding is that we, of course, one thing is what we are actually able to measure in science, but even though we are able to verbalize something, and science is very often connected to something to verbalize it, to put it into words, to speaking, I still believe that there's something missing, that human existence, and maybe even what is the most values, what is most important in human existence, the more difficult it is to bring words into existence to express it. And this is like, we have been talking about metaphors, and we have been talking about all these, this part of existence that we are not able to express with words. And I think that's also very important to have in mind when we are talking about AI, and so especially because I think also there's a difference between wisdom, ethics, and information. And AI is like artificial information. It's not artificial intelligence in the understanding of what intelligence is as a Greek knows. The word knows in the Greek sense of intelligence. So that also have some implication in my understanding of what AI could give us, even trying to bring happiness to one person. But at the same time, I believe that, well, if we had turned it upside down and been talking about what, I mean, discussing what kind of wealth do we need to be able to not be unhappy? How much do we actually need as a human being to be not unhappy? I think that would be an easier way to try to bring AI into what could help human on this question. Yes.
And if I've understood correctly, yeah, what you said makes sense in terms of, so what you're saying is, let me see if I've understood this, is AI is not going to be able to decide whether you're happy or not. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, and I agree with that, because then I think for what you said earlier, it might just be impossible to define it, or what Cameron said earlier as well, is there might be multiple people might have different definitions of happiness. And then another one is over what period of time do you define happiness? And I sometimes try to demystify it with simplifying examples, but me going and having my Big Mac, okay, well, let's assume I'm vegetarian, my veggie Mac now, that might make me short-term happy, but might make me feel unhealthy later on, and therefore it's unhappy. So there's a lot of things in there, and I agree, regardless of which stance you take, whether there's multiple definitions of happiness or whether the fact that you just can't define it, it's going to be hard for an AI to optimize for something which we can't calculate. I think Steve used the word, yeah. If we can't define the calculation, it's going to struggle to optimize it. But let me ask you a question. AI can't do that, but can another human do it? Like, is it possible for you to give me a set of instructions on how to be happy, for you to define my end state as a human? So let's imagine you are the AI, right? Okay, it's just your biological mass rather than computational mass. Could you do it?
I think one of the possibility human have that AI don't have is to be the model, not by words but by action. And this is like one of the main understanding of knowledge in practice, and this idea that we actually prove, or we show wisdom through our action, and we bring this forth by being the model of other people. And this is even when children are very young, they're giving knowledge through the parents in their modeling, that they even bring forth in the next generation when they become parents themselves. So in my understanding of knowledge and of existence, then this is an example of how there are non-verbal knowledge that is extremely important, especially in an ethical perspective.
I'm glad you bring that up, because it's something we haven't touched on yet, that AI, at least in its current iteration, the technology of AI uses as its training set human language, and you can go on to either side of that. It doesn't use raw data of experience yet. I mean, maybe it could, because that can also be reduced to ones and zeros, although that would be, almost infinitely more training data, like wavelengths of light and, velocities of particles and things like that. It's not using that. It's using human language, which already embeds certain moral valence. Words have moral valence. And so an AI trained on words will already have, I think, some moral valence because of that. But then on the opposite side, also the training set doesn't include what you were just talking about, actions, examples, these kind of unquantifiable but nevertheless tangible aspects of human experience. That we're not talking about the invisible realm here. We're talking about things that the example of a life well lived. That's not reducible to words. So AI is somewhere in the middle of this kind of range of possible inputs, and it's stuck for the moment with human language, with all of its powers and capabilities, but also with all of its limitations. And so, GIGO to some extent.
I would like to raise another complication, and I think that we really need another session on this, because this is obviously a very both broad and deep subject. I think I would like to bring into the picture the dynamics of potential. I mean, because I think that ethics is not something that is constant. What I mean is that you cannot say that something is ethical at every stage of development, whether it's development of an individual or development of humanity. So somehow there is this evolving human potential, both collectively and individually. And I think at different stages of the unfoldment of that potential, ethics, I mean, I think ethics has a dual role, both to sort of make possible the transformation to the next level of potential being realized, but also then defining what is right at that stage of potential. So there are certain things that I think would be ethically right for an adult that are not necessarily ethically right for a child. And so anyway, so I'm just wondering whether we should see this sort of evolutionary dynamics of ethics, and I think partly where we are seeing difficulties in bringing together Athens and Jerusalem is that followers of religions typically think that there has been once, or if not only once, but at least in their case, there's a sort of a final definition of what is right or what life is about, or how humanity should live, and then that's it. And it seems like what may have been very well ethical 1400 years ago in certain circumstances, in a certain historical context, makes absolutely no sense today. And so it's not that one is on it. I mean, yeah. So it's like stoning to death and chopping arms may have been ethically justifiable at a certain stage of human development in a certain historical context. It's difficult to justify them in today's world, and so I think there's this aspect of sort of evolutionary aspect of ethics that we should also keep in mind. And I don't know how AI could help us with that.
I'll say very quickly, I think this is where AI really has great power, because to the extent to which an ethical action is contextually bound to your time and place, your age, your, wherever you're at, an AI system is really great at automatically adjusting for that. In the prompt, you can say, I am an X doing Y at time Z. So what's the ethical thing to do now? And it can, sort of quickly adapt, as people have, shown in great examples already. Explain to me X concept, from I'm 10 years old, explain this concept to me. And AI is fantastic at that. And so I think this is one area where I would say the AI would be a strength rather than a weakness when it comes to navigating that degree of the complexity of the problem.
Yeah, I think this is true. If we look sort of back into our evolution, I wonder, and from the beginning, I think that thinking about AI and its possibilities helps us to better understand our own human world and our ethics. And I think that AI would be hard pressed to know what the next evolutionary step is going to be.
Hmm. Although its guess might be as good as ours.
That's true. That's true.
And there's two things here. So earlier on, I said that AI is, that morality or the end state is a function of time, and I think what Cameron is saying over here is actually on a macro scale, there's an evolution of morality, right? I was giving a micro scale of saying, okay, we're on a plane and it's about to crash, but if I jump out of it, the plane's not going to crash because of the weight of the plane or something changes, and therefore it might be ethically okay to push me out of the plane if I'm the oldest person there. And but that was a micro thing. I think, Cameron, what you're talking about is actually throughout humanity's evolution itself. Is there a changing of what that end state should be based upon what our potential is, and can AI ascertain what the potential is? I don't know, but I agree with Stephen's point is that for the realms it's discovered that it's seen already, for the data in the past, and like 10-year-old child versus a 50-year-old child, or I'm in a place at the moment and there's only a certain amount of food, what's the right thing to do? Is probably not going to say eat at all, but if I'm in a place and I say there's loads and loads of food available, it might say put your tummy up. So I definitely get that, but I don't know in the longer term. Just to go along to the previous conversation as well, we talked about AI not being able to do actions, and it's only about words. So in the entirety of this conversation, I've been assuming that at some point it will have a body, and it will be able to go off and interact with the universe on its own, and therefore its pattern recognition capabilities will be able to use reinforced learning to find patterns potentially that we may not have found or may not be able to find. So our ability to find patterns is based upon various experiments. We do experiments, we find a pattern. Force is equal to mass times acceleration. I'd be curious to see, once you put AI into a body and you say, here's a stopwatch, here's some weights, how long please find me some relationships between the variables, how long it takes to come back to us, and goes, oh, by the way, I've discovered Newton's laws. Who knows? Maybe faster than it took humanity to do. So I think actions will at some point be measurable. And then, as to Stephen, your comment as well is, there is an edge case where it might be able to interact in the universe in a way that we can't, right? And that's quantum computing, right? So depending if our brains and everything is acting on not a quantum level, and there's debates about that, but let's assume it's not, and it's effectively a classical machine. If you start talking about things like quantum machine learning, which is effectively learning and finding solutions based upon the evolution of quantum states, in some sense, you're going to have a world where potentially, if it's doing that and has got a body, it's actually got a far richer set. It's got all of the language that we've got. It's got all the capabilities to interact with the universe that we've got. And actually, because it's got more senses, with things like quantum machine learning, etc., it might well be able to think in new ways that we just might not even be able to comprehend. Just throwing that out there. No idea if it's true.
I think oh, go ahead.
No, I like the ideas, or I'm not sure if I like them, but I think if AI becomes action, and also like AI actually takes better choices and have better senses than humanity, I'm pretty sure they're going to decide that human existence, because it's unmoral or unethical or based on bad choices and bad action, then we should just remove it from Earth. And maybe that's the correct answer for this Earth.
But there's something you mentioned, Varqa, early on in this conversation about intention. That it's not just what you do, but what intention you do it with. And I wonder whether, because I sent you a video clip, all of us, by this one professor who was talking about AI, and And what he was saying was that AI sort of gives you the impression of being a conscious thinker, but it doesn't have consciousness, and it doesn't have, in the human sense, a will and an intention. It's just programmed to do certain things. So I wonder whether that is something that is also important in connection with ethics. I mean, that we make ethical choices as conscious beings with at least a relatively free will. And is that something different from what AI is able to do?
Could an AI, an embodied AI, would we regard it as an autonomous moral agent?
Yeah.
Because I think one of the, it's like when I've been listening to this discussion, it's like we're discussing the difference between a consequence ethics and a deontological ethics. And the deontological ethics would, of course, focus on intentionality and on this understanding of human autonomy as the ability to make free choices, or that you have to be responsible for the choices you actually have taken. And I'm not sure if we have this, if this ethics exists and is the correct, and I think it's difficult to understand AI as ethical, because I'm not sure if it's possible for them to take free choices or even to be responsible for the choices it's taken. I think we also, I guess we have to end the discussion now. So Varqa, thank you for being part of the.
No, thank you.
Podcast.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, really nice. And I think what I wanted to use an AI and try to put all these different questions and prompt them with all these different ideas that we have had now in this conversation, to try actually to see what kind of answer does it give me. Or maybe even what questions does it give?
Ask ChatGPT, can you become an immoral agent? Okay.
Rate this debate out of 10.
Maybe you can do that too, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you so much for listening to this episode, and hope to see you again soon, everyone out there.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.